History is stranger than fiction, and often grosser and creepier too. Let's look into some history facts that can amaze you. Someone tried and failed to save Abraham Lincoln, and his life just got darker from there. You're probably familiar with the 1860s illustration, The Assassination of President Lincoln. But who's that pair sharing the private box with the ill-fated president and his wife? The man on the far left, rushing into action, is Major Henry Rathbone. President and Mrs. Lincoln specifically asked him and his fiancée, Clara Harris, to accompany them to the theater. After Booth fired the shot, Rathbone tried to tackle him to the ground, but Booth was able to get free by slicing Rathbone in the arm with a dagger. Rathbone was never free of the memory and guilt of that night, and he reportedly felt responsible for letting Booth get away. In the years to come, he experienced a myriad of health issues, from stomach ailments to heart palpitations, and his mental state deteriorated as well. On December 23, 1883, 18 years after the assassination, he attacked and killed Clara, now his wife, and attempted to kill himself. He would spend the rest of his life in a mental institution. In 1494, Europe experienced the closest thing to a real-life zombie outbreak. Italy's Renaissance period has a major, though little-known, dark side. Sailors returning from the New World brought with them a massive outbreak of syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. The troops then brought what would become known as the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. With no such thing as antibiotics back then, the disease was able to spread unchecked, and its effects were nasty. The skin on victims' faces would essentially rot away from the disease's grisly ulcers. In some cases, the noses, lips, or other body parts of the affected people were essentially gone, and several of the victims eventually died from the disease. So while there was a lot to love about the Renaissance in Europe, the concurrent syphilis outbreak was basically the real-world version of the zombie apocalypse. Dentures used to be made from the teeth of dead soldiers. Why have false teeth when you can have real teeth? That must have been the mentality of 19th century dentists. They combated the outbreak of tooth decay with makeshift dentures, ivory base plates with real human teeth attached. Scavengers were already looting corpses from the Battle of Waterloo for their teeth, and now they could sell the teeth to dentists. The dentist would boil the choppers, cut off the roots, attach them to ivory plates, and sell them to customers. Mental Floss doubts that the customers had any idea where the teeth came from. Whether that makes it more or less creepy is up to you to decide. Boston experienced a deadly molasses flood. This makes the Boston Tea Party look tame. In January of 1919, an enormous molasses tank burst in the north end of Boston. While a molasses flood might sound like a scene from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, it was no laughing matter. The tank contained and released nearly 2.5 million gallons of the sticky substance, which surged through the streets at a whopping 35 miles per hour. It was essentially a full-on tidal wave, reaching nearly 15 feet tall and killing 21 people. 150 more people were injured, and buildings and houses were knocked from their foundations. Emergency responders had trouble reaching the victims since they had to clamber through the sticky sludge. It took Bostonians weeks to clean up the mess, and many residents would claim that, in the summer heat, they could smell the sickly sweet odor of molasses even years later. Thomas Edison created a seriously creepy baby doll. For all of his successful inventions, Thomas Edison did experience a pretty major failure when he tried to create the first ever talking dolls. His 1877 development of the tinfoil phonograph was a major breakthrough in terms of sound recording, and the endless possibilities for this technology were not lost on Edison. In 1890, thanks to the development of the wax cylinder, he was able to produce a line of baby dolls with wooden bodies, porcelain heads, and miniature phonographs in their chests. The dolls were unlike anything the world of toys had ever seen or heard before. The phonographs played back recordings of young women reciting nursery rhymes like "Hickory Dickory Dock" and "Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep." And if ever there were dolls that deserved their own horror flick, it was these. The old garbled technology, the shrill voices, and the dolls' eerie faces combined to make them into nightmare fuel for us today. But that's not actually the reason the dolls were unsuccessful. Their failure was due more to several different things. The pieces were easy to lose, the sound didn't last long and was hard to understand, and the mini phonographs were highly breakable. And finally, the dolls were simply expensive. A king made his subjects worship the corpse of his beloved. This case of star-crossed lovers got weird fast. In 14th century Portugal, the king's son, Dom Pedro, fell in love with Inés de Castro. There were only a couple of problems with this. For one, his father, King Afonso IV, did not approve because Inés was illegitimate. For another, Dom Pedro was married. His father had arranged for him to marry a noblewoman named Constanza, and Inés was Constanza's lady-in-waiting. When Dom Pedro refused to stop seeing her, the king had her killed. When Dom Pedro acceded to the throne 2 years later, he exhumed her body, had it clothed in royal dress, and crowned her queen. According to historical legend, he made the other nobles all kiss her hand as a sign of their devotion. A computer once did in 40 seconds what took a mathematician an entire lifetime. While not gross or scandalous, this history fact is still something of a downer. William Shanks, a 19th century mathematician, spent his entire life calculating the digits of pi. He successfully calculated the first 527 digits and found another 180 digits, though those calculations were incorrect. But calculating the first 527 digits is still impressive. Or rather, it was in 1873. In 1958, a computer calculated that same number of digits in less than a minute, and then calculated another 10,000. Perhaps it's better poor Shanks wasn't alive to see that. If it's any consolation, though, humans did invent that computer. Thank you for watching and subscribe for more.